The morgue always creeped me out as a kid. The cold sterile walls, the rows of metallic drawers housing lifeless bodies. It seemed more like a prison than a resting place. So when my buddy James suggested we explore the old abandoned hospital on the edge of town, famous for the psych ward tragedy of '62, I felt queasy. "Don't be a wuss," James chided, shoving me playfully. "It's just an empty building." Falling in behind my braver friend, I slipped through the gap in the chain-link fence circling the crumbling complex. The main building loomed ahead, gray and ghostly in the moonlight, shattered windows gazed out like vacant eyes. As we approached the front entrance, the door creaked open, beckoning. Against my better judgment, I followed James inside. The lobby was a debris field of broken furniture, dust, and peeling paint. The air smelled sickly sweet, like decay. James swept his flashlight around, illuminating a directory on the wall. "Dude, the morgue is in the basement. Let's check it out." My feet felt heavy and reluctant, but I trailed behind James to the elevator. To my relief, it was out of order. We pried open the doors to the emergency stairwell instead, descending into musty darkness. The walls were marked with ominous graffiti scrawls. Even the air grew colder and heavier as we went down. At last we reached the bottom, the door marked morgue in faded letters. James grinned back at me, eyes glinting with mischief as he turned the handle. The door creaked open, and the sweep of his flashlight revealed a row of body lockers along the wall. A rusted autopsy table stood in the center, blades and implements scattered across its surface. James whistled through his teeth. "This is awesome. Let's check out the drawers." He strode over to the lockers, grabbing the handle of the first refrigerated compartment. My skin crawled, some primal instinct warning me not to look inside, but it was too late. James had the first drawer open. His delighted expression melted into horror. "What the hell?" I stepped closer, morbid curiosity overcoming my unease. Inside the drawer was a body, desiccated and gray, sunken eyes peering up at the ceiling. This was no decades-old corpse from 1962. Scattered across the remaining compartments were similar shrunken, mummified bodies, fresh bodies. James slammed the door shut, breathing hard. Someone's using this place as their own personal morgue. I opened my mouth to respond when heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. James and I exchanged panicked looks. Someone was coming. We scrambled to hide inside one of the empty body lockers, leaving it cracked to see out. Two men in stained scrubs entered, wheeling a gurney holding a limp figure draped in plastic. With ruthless efficiency, they transferred the new body to one of the drawers near ours. Through the gap, I saw a tag tied to the corpse's toe, a name scribbled on it, James Miller. My heart dropped into my gut. James Miller wasn't a random name. It was my friend, standing paralyzed beside me. The men were writing James' name on the locker door, preparing his drawer for when he joined this gruesome collection. They were so close I could smell the blood on their scrubs, hear their casual banter about dissection plans. Finally, after what felt like hours, the men departed and silence fell again. We waited until the echo of their footsteps faded before bursting from the locker and sprinting for the exit. We didn't speak as we raced through the decaying hallways, up the lightless stairs. I could feel unseen eyes tracking our movement. We didn't stop running until we hit the street lamps at the edge of the abandoned complex. Wheezing, racked with horror, gazing back at the looming buildings, I now knew the truth about the 1962 psych ward tragedy. It had never ended. The hospital staff were still quietly collecting bodies to keep their twisted secret operation running. And they had slated my friend James to be next. The old hotel had clearly seen better days. The once grand Victorian building was now run down and neglected. The walls were faded, the shingles weathered, and many of the windows were shattered or boarded up haphazardly. An old tattered sign reading the Grand View Hotel swung creakily over the front entrance in the cold autumn wind. "Well, this looks welcoming," said Amy sarcastically. She shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her slender frame. "It'll be cool, an adventure." Her boyfriend Jake grinned, undaunted by the ominous appearance of the abandoned building. He led the way through the front door hanging crookedly on its hinges. Amy followed reluctantly. The lobby was in shambles. Faded, peeling wallpaper, broken furniture strewn about, dust and debris everywhere. The paired staircase curved gracefully upward toward the higher floors. "Let's check it out upstairs," said Jake eagerly. He jogged up the steps, boards groaning under his feet. Sighing, Amy trailed after him. The second floor was lined with hotel room doors, some half open, others closed tight. Jake peered through each one as he passed by, flashing his light at the debris left behind: bed frames stripped bare, decaying carpets, empty drawers flung open. Amy's unease was growing stronger, but she pushed it down and kept going. As they explored further down the hall, Jake paused by one of the closed doors. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Amy shook her head. Jake leaned closer to the door. "I think there's someone in this room." Amy's pulse quickened. She listened closely but heard nothing besides the creaking and groaning of the old building. Jake tried the handle. It was locked tight. He pounded on the door. "Hello? Anyone in there?" No response came. Amy tugged anxiously on his arm. "Jake, I don't like this. Let's get out of here." "Don't freak out. It's fine," he said. "I just want to see what's behind this one door." He threw his shoulder against it, forcing it open with a crack. Amy held her breath, heart hammering as Jake shone his light into the room. She could see very little beyond the small gap. An unmade bed, a Bible on the nightstand. Jake pushed harder on the stuck door. Amy cried out. The light had briefly illuminated a face peering out at them, but it was gone in an instant. Jake forced the door open wider. He froze, letting out a choked sound. Amy stared over his shoulder and went cold all over. Two corpses lay on the bed, desiccated and grotesque. They seemed to stare right at Amy and Jake with clouded eyes. Jake immediately pulled the door shut. Face pale, they turned and fled down the hall, not stopping until they were back outside in the cold daylight. Amy fell to her knees on the overgrown lawn, gulping air, shaking all over. Jake stood staring up at the hotel facade. His eyes were haunted, and his voice trembled when he finally spoke. "I think those were the original owners. Like they died in there, decades back, and no one ever knew." Amy just whimpered in reply. They never went back to the Grandview Hotel after that day. Some doors were better left unopened. Here is another new scary story about an abandoned building with an interesting plot, unique text, unexpected ending, and title. The old Victorian mansion stood ominously at the end of the overgrown driveway, looking worn and forgotten. Ivy crawled up its walls like long skeletal fingers, reaching for the windows as if trying to peer inside. Mark hadn't been back here in over 20 years, not since that fateful summer after high school graduation. He felt a chill run down his spine as memories flooded his mind. Taking a deep breath, Mark pushed open the rusted front gate and started up the path. The sound of gravel crunching under his feet seemed deafening in the stillness surrounding the house. As he reached the front porch, the boards creaked and groaned under his weight. Cobwebs covered the doorway and front windows like ghostly curtains. With a trembling hand, Mark turned the doorknob and stepped inside. A thick layer of dust covered the furniture and floors. All was dark and silent. Moving further into the foyer, Mark felt the hairs on his neck stand up. A strange energy seemed to emanate from the very walls of this place. He made his way into the parlor where he and his friends had spent that fateful graduation night all those years ago. A tarnished silver bottle of whiskey still sat on the mantel. Mark shuddered, remembering how the night had started out as cheerful, drunken revelry among friends, before things went horribly wrong. It was in this very room that Mark had got into a heated argument with his best friend James over a girl they both wanted to date. Fueled by alcohol and jealousy, fists flew and shirts were grabbed. Mark hadn't meant to shove James so hard. He stumbled back, and before Mark could catch him, his head struck the edge of the fireplace mantel. James fell like a limp rag doll to the floor, the crack of his skull on wood echoing in Mark's ears. Blood. There had been so much blood. Mark stood paralyzed, watching it pour from his friend's head to the polished wooden floorboards. He didn't know what to do. His mind swirled in panicked confusion. So he ran. He left James there and fled from the house, driven by fear and shock. Shortly after, Mark and his family had moved away from that town, from that haunted house, but he was drawn back here now, like a sinner to the scene of his crime. Walking over to the fireplace, Mark half expected to see the dark stain still there after all these years, but the old boards showed no sign of what happened that night. Kneeling down, Mark placed his hand on the floor. "I'm sorry, James," he whispered. As his fingers brushed the floor, Mark lifted his hand, and it came back smeared with something dark, wet, shiny, and red. His heart seized in terror. Blood was still seeping up from the cracks in the floorboards, or it had settled into the very bones of this house. Mark scrambled back in horror, staring at the growing pool of blood. Then he saw him. A figure stood in the doorway, face obscured by shadows, but Mark knew who it was with dreadful certainty. James took a step forward into a dusty beam of light. His eyes stared vacantly, blood still pouring from the gash in his head after all these years. He had been trapped in this house the whole time. Mark opened his mouth to scream, but nothing came out. James raised one arm, pointing at Mark in accusation as blood dripped from his fingers. He took another shambling step forward. Mark's mind finally unfroze, and he turned to run wildly from the house. James followed after him, fleshless feet pounding on the old floorboards. Mark burst through the front door and sprinted down the path, James' footsteps right behind him. As Mark ran through the front gate, he risked a glance back at the house. In the dusty attic window, dozens of pale ghostly faces stared down at him. James and all the others who had died within these walls due to Mark's actions. He ran until his lungs burned for air, until the haunted house was far behind him. But Mark knew he could never outrun what he had done. The ghosts would follow him forever, their blood on his hands staining his very soul.